Because I've known South Georgia since 1933. I've mapped it, took me 4 seasons. I've lived on my own patch, cost me $1 a year for a square mile. I've enjoyed a peace of mind there I've experienced nowhere else. So this is a very personal view of the island I fell in love with 50 years ago. Unblinkered, I think. The island where we just fought a mini war. The island where I suppose I belong. Though I do begin to wonder in my 70s if I shall be allowed to see it again. This is not, as you might think, the scene of some forgotten shootout in the Midwest. It is our legacy to the erstwhile whaling metropolis of South Georgia, or, if you like, a commemorative plaque to our business acumen in the Southern Ocean. And I look at the dereliction and the squalor, and I ask myself, did we have to? And when the killing had to stop, could we not have bowed out in better order? The armchair geographers of the 18th century cherished a dream that there would one day be discovered the great South Land, temperate of climate, supportive of an exotic flora and fauna, inhabited by a cultured race of men not unlike Europeans. The reality, first encountered in January 1775 by Captain James Cook of the brig Resolution, was indeed different. A bleak and desolate landfall far to the east of Cape Horn, and even further removed from the wishful thinking of the stay-at-home theorist by the fireside. Nevertheless, new lands, however forbidding, must not be left to the next man. And Captain Cook had his orders, which he carried out and recorded forthwith in the ship's log. As soon as we drew near the shore, having hoisted out a boat, I landed at 3 different places, displayed our colors, and took possession of the country in His Majesty's name under a discharge of small arms. But South Georgia, the Isle of Georgia as Cook named it, was a bitter disappointment, and he made no bones about it. Lands doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspect I have not words to describe. But that's an over-harsh appraisal of a typical subantarctic environment. South Georgia is a major mountain range shouldering out of the cold waters of the Southern Ocean to nearly 10,000 feet. It lies squarely in the path of the west winds and is rather more than 50% ice-covered. The result is a severe, damp, cold climate, cloudy, foggy, windy, with snow at sea level for 6 months in the year and an average temperature of just above freezing. Day long, a day and a night. I've known South Georgia keep this up for a week on end. But when it does come good, so an island of moods, of contrasting extremes, so that you write up your diary one day in fear and trembling, and the next in a state of euphoria. And on a calm, clear summer's day, when the water shows blue and the tussock green, when scree and crag look sandy hot in the sun, and the high tops are dazzlingly free of cloud, when perhaps the only proof of latitude and longitude is a wisp of brash ice in the bay and the quack of a penguin. No environment could be more peaceful and few more beautiful. The truth lies somewhere in between. South Georgia can frustrate the explorer, confound the tourist, and turn on the naturalist. Once the spring thaw gets underway, the explosion of wildlife on the beaches and in the tussock exceeds all expectation, even if you've been there before. Small wonder that the hasty men of the Resolution mistook the king penguin for the fool he is not, rather than the gentleman he is. These birds were so dull as hardly to waddle from us. We easily overtook them by running and knocked them down with sticks. You'd never think this opulent feather-mantled tycoon could mutate into a slimline dandy tailored for the races, would you? The island can boast a flight of seabirds second to none. From the diminutive Wilson's petrel to the wandering albatross with a wingspan of up to 14 feet. Lovely to look at, majestic in flight, aloof as becomes an aristocrat of wind and wave, and marvelously endowed to go a-courting. South Georgia has never appealed much to explorers. It's too inclement, too physically difficult and dangerous, and it's not big enough to hold out any hope of a major discovery. The island's appeal has been to the merchant adventurer who sought to make himself a quick buck with little regard for the long-term practicalities and less for the ethics. Here, and only a few weeks' sail from the markets of China, Captain James Cook had stumbled on a limited El Dorado that the British and American fur sealers were quick to appreciate and to exploit. It was a primitive slaughter and indiscriminate. The sealers took the lot. One eyewitness describes how a large party would cautiously land to leeward of the rookery if possible. Then, at a given signal, all hands would approach them, shouting and using their clubs to the best advantage. Many hundreds were frequently taken in one of these knockdowns. Another contemporary account affirms that Captain Edward Fanning of the American corvette Aspasia visited this island in 1800 and secured a cargo of 57,000 fur seals, and that 16 other vessels procured at the same island in no more than 4 months 65,000 fur seal skins, making a total of 122,000 taken there in a single season.
On this evidence, it's hardly surprising that the outcome for the fur seals of South Georgia, in a mere 30 to 40 years, was a virtual extermination. Sealing is a wasteful business, always has been. You want either a skin with fur on it or a layer of blubber with the skin on it. The rest, the carcass, and that's 90% of the whole, is carrion. Something for the scavengers, for the giant petrels and the Antarctic skuas, both big, clumsy birds with powerful beaks and a voracious appetite. In fact, it's quite usual for the giant petrel, known as a stinker, to gorge to such repletion that it has to throw up before it can take off. He's a bit of a cannibal too, the Antarctic skua, and quick to turn on anyone of his own kind who's sick or injured or for some reason no longer able properly to defend himself. But perhaps we're not the species to criticize on that score. This is a coast where if you don't swim and can't fly, your movements will be restricted, to say the least. In fact, you won't ever get there in the first place. So everybody does swim or fly, and some better than others, some best of all. The sealers of the early 19th century had two strings to their bow, a luxury trade in the pelt of the fur seal and a worldwide demand for the blubber, the clear, sweet oil of the elephant seal. So they butchered both. First the fur seal, because it was less trouble and more profitable. Then, and with an inspired barbarity, the elephant seal. I remember standing on what had been a highly esteemed sealing beach in Undine South Harbour and trying to evoke in my own words how it once was. There was a time when these beaches were so thick with seals, the bulls so jealous of their harems, contesting all approach, and so large, that the sealers resorted to a stratagem. They blinded each bull in one eye. And having then, because I couldn't feel the occasion, the circumstances, to quote a contemporary reaction, it was then laughable to see these old goats planted along the beach and keeping their remaining peeper fixed on their seraglios, the wives and concubines, while the sailors passed unheeded between their blind side and the water's edge. And I remember my summing up. This made it that much easier to set foot ashore and get on with the killing, which was indiscriminate, sparing neither bull nor cow nor calf, until it failed to show a profit. Between the wars, when elephant sealing became once again a part of the South Georgian scene, it was conducted under license so as to conserve stocks. But the technique had hardly changed. You drove your seal to the water's edge, killed him, flensed him, rafted off the blubber skin, and left the rest to rot. But no more clubbing. The mate used a 303. Of course, it didn't always go according to plan. I remember seeing Leon, the mate of the sealer Albatross, in confrontation with a young bull, and quite a big one, that hadn't read the script. There it was, still 50 meters from the sea, fighting a rearguard action and giving not 1 inch. So Leon slung his rifle, scuttled round behind, leapt aboard like a jockey, whacked it up the tail flippers, and rode it through the tussock and down the beach and into the surf. Then he dismounted and shot it. This is a sealer's tripod. How many tons of blubber and gallons of oil have spewed and bubbled? And how many penguins, yes, penguins, have burned beneath or boiled within to add to the take-home pay? Imagine it if you can. The great black tripod on the fire. The file of trim, frock-coated victims shuffling and bowing with grotesque dignity to extermination. And what more infernal pantomime have we been responsible for than that? And then, almost overnight, all were gone. The little ships, the brutish men, all the shabby paraphernalia of the killing ground. And for 60, 70, 80 years, the island could gentle her hard-pressed wildlife, making good their losses, but so slowly, and be lulled by an epoch of blissful neglect into a sense of utterly false security. The bones of Leviathan, of the blue whale and the fin, and of Moby Dick the sperm whale, who once fed and swam in these waters and sang their songs. You hear them now. Now this was the technique, the hand harpoon struck from a pulling boat, that had worked well enough in the Arctic and the temperate zones. But it wasn't one that could be used effectively against the whales of the Antarctic, twice as large and half as fast again. By this time, the latter part of the 19th century, It was clear to the whalers of the world that they must rethink their profession so that they could give the traditional and more accessible fishing grounds a rest and move in on the inexhaustible, and don't forget that's how it seemed to them, the inexhaustible whale stocks of the Southern Ocean. But they'd have to improve the system. No more grappling to the dead whale in a seaway, and flensing it, stripping it of blubber alongside, and hoisting the so-called blankets on deck, and boiling them down in tripods set in firewood, and casting the carcass adrift because they'd no useful way of disposing of it. Slow, laborious, dangerous, wasteful, and there had to be a technical breakthrough. It came with the development of the steam whale catcher and the invention of the explosive harpoon, giving the whalers both speed and firepower to open up the fishing grounds around Antarctica. In December 1904, Captain C.A. Larsen arrived in South Georgia to initiate 20th century whaling from the shore station of Grytviken, where purposefully, opportunely, unobtrusively, the whalers proceeded to make their fortunes. Even before the outbreak of the First World War, Antarctic whaling, especially in South Georgia, had mushroomed. There were, by 1911, 8 stations operating in the island, wastefully but very profitably, though the government of the Falkland Islands, to whom application had to be made for both lease and license, was already apprehensive of the effect of so much fishing on the whale stocks and was beginning to apply certain practical curbs, limiting the number of catches, insisting that the scrot, the carcass, be utilized as well as the blubber. Nevertheless, the whale catch figures during and after the war continued to rise, the whale stocks noticeably to decline, until even the whalers were expressing concern. They were also, of course, still making a very great deal of money. And on one classic occasion, to play their part in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, the man of the moment was Sir Ernest Shackleton, the greatest leader, and I quote, that ever came on God's earth, bar none. It was Shackleton's vision that he should bestride Antarctica from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, so that the first crossing of the last continent should be achieved by a British expedition. It was not to be. Within 18 months of departing Grytviken, Shackleton and his 27 men were castaways on Elephant Island. They were 1,300 kilometers southwest of South Georgia, and their situation was critical. The men were ailing. A second winter was pressing. Survival now depended on getting word of their plight, and by word of mouth, no wireless, back to the world of men. So while 22 of them prepared to sit it out, Shackleton handpicked a crew of 5 to challenge with him in the 23-foot James Caird those 1,300 kilometers to South Georgia. On the evening of the 16th day, under dire stress of weather and thirst, they inched the James Caird ashore on the uninhabited southwest coast. The whaling stations lay on the northeast coast. So the job wasn't done, and they would have to finish it on foot. But no time to rest up, convalesce, recuperate. 22 men were marooned on Elephant Island, would probably die on Elephant Island, unless help came, a chain reaction that could only start from the whaling stations of South Georgia. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 19th of May, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley and Crean set out from King Haakon Bay for the whaling station of Stromness, with a full primus and food enough for 3 brewers. They had 50 feet of rope and a carpenter's adze for an ice axe. But no skis, no sledge, no sleeping bags, and no tent. They could therefore neither sleep nor take shelter, nor turn back. It took them in the event 36 hours non-stop, and circumstances all but ambushed them to defeat in the last mile. It was the second day of the march, and they'd listened that morning to the steam whistle from Stromness. They were in familiar country and could actually see the whaling station. They reckoned, and who wouldn't, that they were home and dry. But, and I use Shackleton's own words, the last lap of the journey proved extraordinarily difficult. The sole possible pathway seemed to be a channel cut by water running from the upland. And we were at the wrong end. To go up again was scarcely thinkable in our utterly wearied condition. The way down was through the waterfall itself. So they lowered each other down on their 50 feet of rope and left it hanging. It must have been about coffee time on May the 20th that Shackleton, Worsley and Crean approached the whaling station. They were scarecrow ragged and unrecognizably dirty, as their reception showed. When quite close to the station, we met two small boys. They gave us one look, then they ran from us as fast as their legs would carry them. We met an old man who started as if he had seen the devil himself. Even their old friend, Captain Surley, the winter manager, emerged from the villa to stare, nonplussed. He didn't know them. But the rest, the rescue of the 3 men in King Haakon Bay, the 22 men on Elephant Island, the rest would now follow. Shackleton had never lost a man. He never would. It wasn't quite the end of the story. The end of the story came 5.5 years later, on the 5th of January 1922, when Shackleton, on his way south again in the Quest, died here of a coronary and was buried in the whalers' cemetery at Ritviken. More personal are the cairn and cross erected by the old guard, the men of the Quest. The first thing you see when you arrive, the last when you depart. "25 years ago, on a good fishing day, you'd see the catchers and the towboat running a shuttle service to the 3 active whaling stations on the island, Ritviken, Husvik, Leith, wallowing in with half a dozen whales in tow and frisking out after a quick turnaround to get back on the fishing grounds. It was a drill as regimented as square bashing, with the day's catch floating belly up in the queue, and the stinkers and the skewers and the Cape pigeons, the little black and white greedy guts who can't stop talking, all set to guzzle themselves sick. If I don't remember whaling as a conservationist would have me, and I don't, it's because only the kill was horrific. The chase was all speed and, more often than not, physical discomfort and a mounting excitement. And everything that was done to the whale that happened after the kill was an impressive technical exercise of no emotional significance whatsoever. You can grieve for a man and his dog, dead. A seal, an elephant, a budgerigar. You cannot grieve, or if you do, I think you deceive yourself, for 50 tons of really rather good steak and about the same amount of bone, fat, and offal. But if you are present at the moment of truth, you must shut off so that you do not hear the muffled explosion within the flesh, nor see the shock waves in the water, nor in your mind's eye and the perceptions of your heart comprehend the stricken tissues of Leviathan. It was on a softwood slipway called the Plan that the whalers administered the last rites, winching the dead whale out of the water, peeling the blubber off the meat, flensing it was called, stripping the meat off the bones, lemming, putting the bones to the bone saws. The long-handled hockey stick knives were razor sharp, their safe and proper use a highly skilled job. Blubber, meat and bones then went into their respective cookers to extract the oil. It didn't take long. You could dispose of a 60-foot fin whale weighing 50 tons in 20 minutes flat. This is, I promise you, the warmest time of the year, when you might reasonably expect South Georgia to put on a summer frock and not be in too much of a hurry to change it. She isn't like that. The wind can come from flat calm to 50 knots in as long as it takes to pitch camp. And a man can stand on the divide between two valleys and look left into lambent sunshine, right into a whiteout. It's weather not to be trusted, which was one very good reason for explorers leaving so well alone that there was still no map of the island in 1950. I've always reckoned Prince Olaf the most picturesque of all the whaling stations. Looks like an oil painting, doesn't it? But when the industry went into decline in the 1930s, this was the first one to go and be sold off and cannibalized. Boilers to Leith, the Villa to Grytviken, where they were still making a bomb, and not just the management. A run-of-the-mill cook could pay off at the end of the season with upwards of £500. And that was big money just after the last war. He could winter in South Georgia and work a second season and pay off with nearer £1,500. And that was very big money indeed. It was a bit like working for North Sea Oil, but I think more interesting. Go for a walk in the tussock and along the shore, and you had company. You don't, of course, have to go that far today. The locals have long since repossessed Prince Olaf. In 1911 and 1912, the Norwegian whalers introduced a total of 17 reindeer, 5 bucks and 12 does. They liberated these in the coastal grasslands of the Stromness and Cumberland Bay areas, and looked forward to the time when venison would feature regularly on their menus. It didn't take all that long. Reindeer are reluctant to cross permanent ice, so the glaciers encircling the new arrivals effectively confined them to green pastures. The result, after 70 years, is a combined herd of around 2,000, which is quite a success story. And there's another success story, I mean, but nothing to do with Tom, Dick, and Harry, whose sights are set on saving face, would you say? In 1955-56, Nigel Bonner, then sealing inspector, reported a few fur seals in the northwestern approaches to the island. By the mid-1960s, it was apparent that upwards of 20,000 were breeding on Bird Island and beginning to colonize the mainland. Then came the real population explosion that has rocketed the fur seals of South Georgia in some 15 years to a bewildering 500,000. Now, wouldn't you, if you'd been written off and had made that sort of a comeback, wouldn't you have yourself a ball? When I look at the beaches and the grasslands hereabouts, and this major South Georgian river, alive again with the ebullient fur seal, I can't help feeling that Ludwig Cole Larsen and his wife, she was here too, christened these precincts better than they knew. They called them the Tal der Hoffnung, Hope Valley. What I miss when I browse through a whaling station today is the smell. First time you were nauseated and reached for the eau de cologne. And then in a matter of weeks you didn't notice it, and now, half a lifetime later, you actually miss it. It was the smell of an industry that dealt in death, and not at all prettily. But it also stood for technical invention and a practical self-reliance and bloody hard work. Gerald Elliott, chairman of Christian Salvesen Limited of Leith, was a whaler. And whalers are businessmen, and whalers of his generation are also men of pride and principle. Let me quote him. The reasons we pulled out of whaling hadn't anything to do with any lobby, because there wasn't any lobby in those days. It was still considered a very honorable profession, and we were all proud to be whalers, and very sad to have to leave it. And I certainly believe strongly and passionately that one should never risk the disappearance of one particular species. I hope Gerald Elliott's testimony will go some way towards putting straight a record that other times and other practices have brought into disrepute. It isn't anymore, but the pursuit of Moby Dick was once a very honorable profession. Could almost be any time, any place, until you look closely at the pin-ups. They're all vintage, along with the cinema, which was 2 Nissan huts equipped with seating for 600. Came from the old Alhambra picture house in Leith Walk, Edinburgh, and 2 projectors, and that was progress, when you could give a continuous performance and not stop every 10 minutes to change reels. Though it was hardly an advantage when the films were downright bad, which is something the old stagers are still prepared to harp on. Not exactly moaning, but, well, there was precious little entertainment in the island. The reason for the floating dock at Stromness, and there was another at Grytviken, there still is, was that the whalers should be able to service their own boats and carry out all but the most major repairs on the spot. Which is why, at the end of the season, the various companies used to leave behind a considerable winter workforce. Incidentally, don't think that South Georgia is an island of underground brooks and bubbling springs. It's just that the pipes have burst. At a pinch, the last-ditch whalers in the decade before the shutdown could have about built a whale catcher from scratch. Their machine tools were equal to anything in the southern hemisphere: lathes, drills, welding gear. And their men were all tradesmen, platers, welders, engineers, just what any shipyard would have. But it wasn't enough. Neither the expertise and economy, nor the beautiful, clean, white, pure oil and the byproducts: bone meal, meat extract, as good as oxo or bovril any day, to offset rising costs and cutthroat competition. The end would seem to have come very suddenly. The craftsmen downed tools and goggles and went for a tea break and haven't come back yet. They will, I'm sure they will. You can't walk out on a lifeboat that needs new sheathing on the keel. Or can you? There's always the Marie Celeste.
What happened, I think, was that nobody, from the manager right down to the Group 8 whalers, the lowest form of animal life as they were known, nobody foresaw the long-term depredations of wind and weather. The resolute looting by the Russians and the Poles, and by our own people. The sordid decline of Boomtown once the gold rush was over, into a turd. Nobody foresaw this. And I doubt even more whether anybody ever heard, borne on some freak prophetic whisper of the wind, a distant sound of guns. Of the lunatic cannonade that was to echo across King Edward Cove in Gridvicken, here where it had all begun, when in April 1982 the Argentine junta decided to make good their paper claim to South Georgia by force of arms. They saw to it that they had their pretext, of course. A contingent of scrap metal merchants from Buenos Aires going about their legitimate business ashore. They weren't interested in half-submerged little hulks, but raising the Argentine flag and being told to take it down. There were other irregularities, all pretty trivial, but enough to trigger off the invasion and 3-week occupation of the island. They were built as whale catchers, these three. When I knew them, they were the last sealers working out of Gridvicken. Petrel is still seaworthy. Diaz and Albatross, smaller and more vulnerable, appealed to the latter-day vandals who opened the seacocks. And I find that very hard to take. This is the Lutheran church at Gridvicken. It predates the First World War, but as churches go, has never been a great success. An occasional church, you might call it. It was used for Sir Ernest Shackleton's funeral in 1922. It was used again when his son, the present Lord Shackleton, visited his father's grave in 1976. More recently, and for some years now, it has been opened up by British Antarctic Survey for their Christmas carols. And it was used yet again by them and for a last secular occasion as a sanctuary for all civilian personnel during the Battle of Gridvicken on the 3rd of April, 1982. So what happens next? Or is this truly the end of one of history's bad jokes, of nature's raw deals? And when I look again at the dereliction and the squalor, all self-inflicted, I can't help feeling either way that it bloody well serves us right. But did we have to? And I don't mean the mind-boggling futility of our mini-war. I mean the 200 years of killing that had preceded it. I suppose, probably, yes and no. In the beginning, there were these three admirable species, the whale and the seal and the larger of the penguins, who, by their regrettable extermination, could contribute to our well-being. And since when have we been able to deny ourselves a killing with such potential for cash and advancement? But we're not usually quite so messy while we're at it, and we do usually tidy up. Surely, when man has dwelt in such a place of beauty as this and moves on, he should erase all significant trace, and not leave a slum for the ubiquitous vandal further to desecrate and despoil. Because this is an insult to the stage and the creature players, and a warning. For let it not be presumed that we shall conduct ourselves with any better grace should the secret places of Antarctica presently disclose yet another crock of gold. Some comfort there may be at the end of the day, and if there be any justice, when we shall have exhausted our capacity for wreaking havoc and must face a reckoning. It is not then we who will survive, but the island.